The following program was funded through a grant from the Springfield Cable Endowment.
Springfield is justly proud of its science museum, and it should be. It is an outstanding institution for a city this size. It offers so much to see and do for people of all ages. But did you ever stop to think, how did the Springfield Science Museum come to be? Who were the people behind it? How did it evolve over the years to become the multifaceted institution it is today? The story begins over a century and a half ago. The people of the Pioneer Valley have always had a passion for education and a curiosity about scientific things. During the 1800s, public and private schools, academies, and institutions of higher learning were being established throughout the region. Education was one of New England's greatest assets. Even before Springfield became an incorporated city in 1852, clubs and societies organized to explore common interest in science, botany, and agriculture. These groups met in private homes or at various schools and civic buildings in the community. It soon became apparent that a more formal and identifiable institution was needed for people to pursue these scientific interests and to house the collections they generated. In the fall of 1859, 4 leading Springfield residents, Reuben Chapman, Daniel Harris, John King, and George Otis Jr., met to discuss the establishment of a Museum of Natural History and of Curiosities. Their discussion and subsequent actions led to the creation of the Springfield Ethnological and Natural History Museum. The stated goal of this endeavor was to display a collection of specimens of natural history and to be a repository of curious and instructive objects. The museum was established in late 1859 and occupied a single room as part of the city library in the original Springfield City Hall. Almost immediately, people began donating artifacts and money to support the fledgling museum. And in a short time, the museum had collected 6,000 natural history specimens, including a surprising number of Native American artifacts and objects from foreign countries. With the new museum providing a focal point for their interests, more science-oriented groups formed. Their specialties covered medicine, engineering, archaeology, horticulture, biology, and geology. The increased interest in the museum soon taxed its limited space. Fortunately, in 1871, the library moved into its own building with a larger room set aside for the science collections. This arrangement was satisfactory only for a short while. Soon the museum was bursting at the seams again. In 1886, George Walter Vincent Smith and his wife Belle promised their vast art collection to the Library Association. The citizens of Springfield raised the money to construct a building to house the treasures. The George Walter Vincent Smith Art Museum was completed in 1896. And a large hall of ethnology was set aside exclusively to display the natural history collections. From its inception, the Science Museum had relied on volunteer curators to manage the various departments, or cabinets as they were called. But in 1894, in anticipation of the move to the new Smith Museum, Grace Pettis was hired as the first paid assistant curator. While the museum had never before enjoyed so much dedicated space, it soon became evident that nothing short of having its own building would enable the museum to meet the needs of the community for programs and exhibits. A subscription drive was mounted in mid-1897, and within 90 days, the generous people of Springfield had given enough money to begin plans in earnest for a new science museum building. Architect Eugene Gardner of Springfield was hired to design the building. It would be 2 stories, state-of-the-art, and located near the library and the Smith Art Museum. Gardner chose to design the building in the Beaux-Arts style, which was in vogue at the time and which was compatible with the Smith Museum. On October 16, 1899, the newly completed Museum of Natural History opened its doors to eager crowds. The 125-foot-long main hall contained collections and displays covering ethnology, archaeology, and all types of minerals, botanical specimens, shells, insects, birds, and mammals. Among the displays was Samuel Colton Booth's collection of choice minerals and geological specimens donated by his daughter, Mary A. Booth, the Luman Andrews Herbarium that displayed local plants, and an extensive bird collection from Robert Wallace. And Nathan and Gurdon Bill contributed displays of birds and animals shown in their native habitat. These exhibits became quite popular. Systematically arranged archaeological and ethnology collections, both local and national, were displayed on the second floor of the new museum. There were also artifacts from Native Americans living in the region from around 12,000 years ago to the 17th century. These included important collections from Samuel Colton Booth, his daughter Mary Booth, Dr. Philip Kilroy, Harry L. Hawes, Daniel Lester Harris, and Jacob T. Bown. Mr. Bown was also instrumental in helping the museum acquire a unique collection of early stone implements from Egypt, Europe, and India, which were collected by H.W. Seton Carr of London, England. Nathan Bill also donated his collection of over 200 Native American baskets, most of which came from the Northwest Coast and California. The Catherine Howard Memorial Library of Science expanded the museum's scientific literature by several thousand volumes. In 1909, Grace Pettis was given the title of director, replacing William Orr, who resigned as curator to take a post as Massachusetts Deputy Commissioner of Education. From the very beginning, the museum worked closely with the region's scientifically oriented clubs and groups, conducting field work which often yielded significant findings. School programs became popular and groups flocked to participate in a variety of activities for youth of all ages. Special prizes were offered for projects, displays, collections, and writings. In fact, many of these events were quite sophisticated and produced some of the earliest horticultural shows in the area. Meanwhile, lectures by professors from regional colleges helped to increase audience attendance as well as enhancing the stature of the museum. In time, the museum was the site of regional scientific conferences and lectures, which further added to the value and importance of the institution. With the nation in the grips of the Great Depression, the 30s was a difficult decade for the Pioneer Valley. Still, for science, it was an exciting time. Technological advances in radio, chemistry, transportation, and electronics teased the imagination with the promise of better things to come. The Springfield-built GB airplanes brought fame and fortune to the city and increased interest in flight and related topics like astronomy. Attendance at the museum grew. It was an undeniable fact that more room was again needed at the museum to accommodate the new collections and increased attendance. Despite the Depression, in early 1931, a major addition was planned thanks in large measure to a generous bequest left to the museum by Springfield attorney Stephen E. Seymour. The new addition was designed by the New York City architectural firm of Tilton and Givens. Their Art Deco design was a significant departure from the Beaux-Arts style of Gardner's original building. The new entrance was open to the public in October 1934. This new wing tripled the museum's size and provided space for a large freshwater aquarium, display areas for new exhibits, and large habitat groups. Work immediately got underway to build a planetarium which would be large enough to hold 150 people. This was a grand undertaking for Springfield, for at that time there were only 4 other planetariums in the United States, and they were located in major metropolitan centers. The heart of the planetarium was the projector, which was designed and built by the museum's own technician, Frank Korkus, with help from his brother John. By using all American-made optical components instead of buying from European sources, Korkus was able to save nearly 90% of the cost of traditional projectors without compromising quality or features. The Seymour Planetarium, named for its benefactor, was first opened to the public in the fall of 1937 and was an immediate success. Bradford Washburn, director of the Boston Museum, would proclaim Springfield's planetarium one of the best small planetariums in the world. In fact, Springfield can point with pride to the fact that its Seymour Planetarium is the oldest operational American-made planetarium in the nation. In November of 1940, a new junior department was created. The department, funded by a bequest of Edward M. Walker, was an innovative program to develop the scientific interest of children of various ages. The program provided classrooms, an auditorium, work areas, and an exhibition area. The popular weekend activities included programs covering astronomy, nature, Native American lore, an explorers club, and a world travelers club. There was also a young fry group for children from 5 years old through grade 2. During World War II, in spite of war rationing and a shortage of personnel and materials, the museum tried to offer a full program of activities. The museum also took an active part in helping the war effort. The planetarium was used to train aviators from Westover Airfield in celestial navigation. Developments triggered by the war, like radar, microwaves, rockets, and missiles, created a new surge of interest in science and technology, and the museum responded with suitable exhibits. In 1950, Mrs. Grace Pettis Johnson retired after nearly 50 years of service, turning the reins of director over to Leo D. Otis, who guided the museum until his untimely death in 1958. At which time Dr. Frank D. Korkus was chosen as director. Along with his duties as director, Dr. Korkus continued to be involved with many of the day-to-day activities at the museum.
The Earth's motion on its axis produces the apparent motion of the sky. The stars, the planets, the sun, and the moon all seem to rise in the east, cross the skies to set in the west, except at night in the north sky, and that depends on just where you live on the Earth's surface.
By the early 1960s, it was apparent that the concepts of studying and understanding science had changed, and that the museum's focus had to change accordingly. So it was appropriate that the museum's name reflect that fact. In 1961, the Museum of Natural History was changed to the Springfield Science Museum. At the same time, Gloria Keeney came on board in the new position of Curator of Education. She would stay with the museum for 26 years and be responsible for many innovative changes, including greatly expanded volunteer and school group programming. Many living in the Pioneer Valley were involved with the space program, so it was natural that throughout the 60s, interest in space exploration grew tremendously. NASA brought displays regularly to the museum. The flights of Gemini, Apollo, Ranger, and Mariner explorations boosted museum attendance, and during these flights, the museum regularly established two-way radio communications with the Jet Propulsion Lab in California, so that residents here could get first-hand information. In 1963, a rather unusual guest arrived at the museum, a huge mounted African bush elephant standing 13 feet high and weighing around 7 tons. The elephant, which was put on display in the museum's Hall of Ethnology, was a gift from an anonymous donor who was later identified as R.E. Phelan, Chief Operating Officer of the R.E. Phelan Manufacturing Company of East Longmeadow. In the late 60s, the museum realized again that it needed more space for its ever-expanding collections and services. To satisfy this need, a new wing was planned, made possible by a generous bequest from the late inventor Roy Dexter Tolman and his sister Ethel, both of Worcester. Design of the new wing was commissioned to the local architectural firm of Ray Tessier Associates. Construction was handled by T.A. Daly & Sons of Springfield. And the 2-story Tolman wing was opened to the public in 1972. The wing was home to the museum's new observatory. The observatory housed a telescope that a team of museum technicians and volunteers from the Springfield Stars Club built, including grinding the 20-inch mirror. In 1974, Dr. Frank Corcus retired, turning the job over to Glenn P. Ives. Director Ives embarked on a long-term comprehensive program to improve and modernize the museum's facilities and its educational programs. One of the new exhibits added during this time was Dinosaur Hall, with its dramatic, life-sized Tyrannosaurus Rex. A smaller dinosaur, Coelophysis, was added a short time later. The exhibits provided new understanding of dinosaurs, which had always been a topic of interest locally because of the famous dinosaur trackways found in the Connecticut River Valley. The Science Museum has always tried to respond to the needs and interests of the community. So the museum was receptive when in 1977, Donald Foster, a retired commercial pilot from Springfield, suggested that a display be created to pay homage to the Granville brothers, the aircraft builders who put the city on the map during the early 1930s with their famous GB racing planes. The memorabilia that Foster and volunteers Tom Nallen and Morrill Stone Ring collected, including a Model Zeta Sportster, went on permanent display at the Science Museum in 1983. During the 60s and 70s, Springfield, as with the rest of America, searched for a deeper understanding of the riches inherent in our multicultural society. During the same period, methods of museum display were also changing. The emphasis was to design exhibits which resembled the natural world as accurately as possible. Those two changes came together with the opening of the R.E. Phelan African Hall in June 1981. Crowds were enthusiastic. African Hall was the first permanent exhibit in a New England museum devoted exclusively to Africa. It remains a strong attraction today and serves as a focus for special ethnic programs and events covering African and African American culture, music, textiles, and geography. The Science Museum hosts the annual Ubora Award presented to African Americans from the greater Springfield area for excellence in the fields of science, education, humanities, or the arts. The success of the African Hall prompted the museum to consider other open exhibits and interactive displays. The Exploration Center, opened in October 1987, was designed expressly to create a hands-on experience for visitors. In 1991, Bob Starren took over as museum director. Under his guidance, and thanks to the generosity of Monsanto Chemical Company, a new living display, the Eco Center, was opened to the public in 1995. Located on the lower level of the museum, to minimize potential water damage to collections and other exhibits, the Eco Center combines the traditional diorama approach with a living component, allowing visitors to observe live animals and marine life in a natural environment. In October 1997, an exciting new planetarium show was introduced, and it was an immediate hit with the public.
The Earth. It floats in space, bright and beautiful. An oasis in the darkness. A lovely blue and white orb set against a sea of stars. The Earth's striking beauty comes from the oceans that stretch across nearly 3/4 of its surface. The seas affect everything on the planet.
Oceans in Space incorporated high-tech visual and audio effects to create a presentation that's dynamic, entertaining, as well as educational.
We stand on the shore of another ocean, the cosmic ocean, looking out to the gulfs of space. Stars and galaxies populate the void and beckon to us across impassable distances. Without special habitats, we cannot live in space either. Yet, from the ocean of space, the stars call to us, with a tantalizing promise of planets to explore.
The museum has continued to maintain a strong connection with local amateur science groups such as the Mineral Club, whose volunteers were instrumental in the development of Mineral Hall, which opened in 1996. What goes on behind the scenes at the museum is often as interesting as the displays and exhibits. Only a small fraction of the museum's vast collection is on display at any one time for the general public to see. The museum's collection storage facility on the lower level is a dazzling accumulation of specimens and artifacts from the Connecticut River Valley as well as distant lands, all carefully cataloged and organized. This resource allows the museum to change displays periodically and produce temporary exhibitions, so there's always something new to see and do. In the museum's work areas, skilled artists and technicians create lifelike dioramas and displays using state-of-the-art materials and construction techniques. What does the future hold for the Springfield Science Museum? When David Steer became museum director in October 1998, he assumed the task of guiding the Science Museum into the 21st century. The plans for the next millennium call for a new area to be designated Astronomy Hall, which will focus on space science, astronomy, and planetary geology, and Earth Hall, which will expand the current Mineral Hall and bring museum visitors eye to eye with the giant T-Rex. The Springfield Science Museum has certainly changed physically over the years, from a small, one-room collection of static artifacts to a multi-level edifice housing outstanding collections, dynamic displays, and a highly recognized planetarium. But what hasn't changed is the conviction that exhibits of objects cannot be the only mission of the museum. The museum's first paid curator, Grace Pettis Johnson, said it very eloquently in 1909. Collections are secondary. What they teach is of primary importance. They teach the most to the trained eye and the trained mind. No better work can be undertaken by this institution than to train the eye and mind.
The preceding program was funded by a grant from the Springfield Cable Endowment.